You did everything right, and you still lose. The problem isn't your stockpile. The problem is your assumptions. You bought the water. You stacked the cans. You got a flashlight in every room and a first aid kit under the bathroom sink. You told yourself you were ready. But ready for what exactly? Ready for a summer power outage that lasts a weekend? Maybe. Ready for a full grid-down event hitting in the middle of a brutal American winter, stretching past day 7, past day 10, past the point where FEMA's hotline stops being useful? That is a completely different animal. And the gap between those two scenarios, that invisible, unexamined gap, is exactly where people die. Not from some dramatic, cinematic collapse moment. Quietly, slowly, in their own homes, while still following the plan they were so confident in. That's not a fear tactic. That's a pattern. And it keeps repeating because the survival information most Americans have been handed was never designed to keep them alive through a real, prolonged, freezing temperature grid failure. It was designed to sound helpful at a county fair emergency preparedness booth. There's a difference, a lethal one. Here is something the survival content world almost never tells you. Your house is not a survival shelter. It is a climate control box that requires continuous energy input to remain habitable. The moment that energy stops, the laws of thermodynamics take over, and thermodynamics doesn't negotiate. Heat always moves from areas of higher concentration to lower concentration. That's not a theory. That's physics. The moment your furnace stops running, your house begins bleeding warmth into the surrounding environment at a rate that shocks most people who haven't measured it. In a well-insulated modern home, interior temperatures can drop 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit in the first 12 hours without any active heating source. In an older home, the kind tens of millions of Americans actually live in, that drop can happen in 6 hours or fewer. By hour 24, in a sustained below-freezing outdoor environment, you could be looking at interior temperatures in the low 40s. That is not a discomfort situation. That is the opening phase of a survival situation. And if you have young children, elderly family members, or anyone with a cardiovascular or respiratory condition in that space, you are already past the comfortable margin for error. The house you trust to protect you is, at that point, quietly working against you. The single biggest lie in mainstream preparedness culture, the one repeated so many times it sounds like wisdom, is the 72-hour kit myth. You've heard it. Everybody's heard it. Have 3 days of supplies, and you'll be fine. 3 days. 72 hours. The idea being that by the time your kit runs out, some form of organized official assistance will have arrived to bridge the gap. That guidance was constructed for hurricane response timelines and temperate climates where infrastructure is damaged but not collapsed, and where restoration can begin within days. It was never designed for a mid-January grid failure spreading across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, or any of the dozens of northern and midwestern states that face genuinely dangerous cold for 3 to 4 months of a year. In a major winter grid-down event, the kind driven by a cyber attack on the power infrastructure, a large-scale equipment cascade failure, or a severe geomagnetic storm, restoration timelines are not measured in days. They are measured in weeks, sometimes longer. The 2021 Texas grid failure lasted up to 9 days for some residents, and that was in a state where the average February temperature is mild compared to what Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland experiences in deep winter. 9 days without heat in Texas was a tragedy. 9 days without heat in Minneapolis is a different category of disaster entirely. If your plan runs out of fuel, warmth, and food at hour 72, you're not prepared. You're optimistic. And in a real, sustained, life-threatening event, optimism is not a survival strategy. Cold is patient. That is what people never understand about it until it is too late. It doesn't come screaming through the door. It doesn't announce itself with a dramatic moment you can prepare for and push back against. It seeps. It slides under the window frame. It creeps through the outlet covers on your walls, through every small gap and imperfection in your insulation, and it pulls warmth out of your body and out of your space 1 quiet degree at a time. Cold is the most disciplined and relentless predator in a winter survival scenario, and it operates on a precise, biological schedule that you can predict and counter if you take it seriously. Mild hypothermia begins setting in when your core body temperature drops to 96 degrees Fahrenheit. You start shivering uncontrollably. You lose fine motor control. You begin making worse decisions than normal without realizing it. Moderate hypothermia arrives at 93 degrees. And at that stage, most people don't have an accurate sense of how cognitively impaired they are. They think they're fine. They aren't. Severe hypothermia, the stage that can lead directly to cardiac arrest, begins below 90 degrees. This is not a sequence that plays out over days in the scenarios we're describing. In the wrong indoor conditions, without adequate layering and a heat source, a previously healthy adult can progress from mild into moderate hypothermia in under 4 hours. Cold doesn't offer a warning shot. It just keeps advancing silently on its own timeline. Here is what should make you genuinely angry. The official preparedness resources in this country, the government websites, the FEMA literature, the pamphlets handed out at community centers and fire stations, are built around a legal and logistical framework designed primarily to manage institutional liability, not to maximize your individual odds of survival. They will instruct you to shelter in place and wait for help. They will not tell you that in a sustained winter grid-down event, waiting without a prepositioned heating solution is a slow deterioration that becomes life-threatening for the vulnerable members of your household within 48 to 72 hours. They will suggest you call 211 for the nearest warming shelter. They will not tell you that in a widespread regional emergency, those shelters reach capacity within hours of opening, operate on the assumption that roads are passable and transportation is available, and were not designed to absorb the full volume of people who would actually need them if a genuine long-duration grid failure struck a major metropolitan area in January. This is not a conspiracy. It is a systemic design flaw built into the architecture of public emergency management. The system was not engineered to save everyone. It was engineered to save enough people that the system itself can claim it functioned. Knowing that is not paranoia. It is the foundational piece of honest, realistic preparation, and it is the piece that most people never get because they are still waiting for the official version to tell them the whole truth. Now let's talk about the danger window. This is the specific and predictable corridor of time between hour 48 and hour 96 of a grid-down winter event, where the majority of unprepared American households cross the invisible threshold from uncomfortable and stressed to genuinely, physically dangerous. Understanding why this window exists is critical to surviving it. In the first 48 hours, most people are still operating on a combination of adrenaline and residual optimism. They're layering up, burning through emergency candles, using whatever backup heat resources they have, and telling themselves this will be over soon. The situation feels manageable because it is still novel. The routine of crisis management holds people together in the early phase. By hour 72, the novelty is completely gone. Food supplies are beginning to dwindle in ways that feel real. Morale is fracturing under the combined weight of cold, boredom, fear, and physical discomfort. Indoor temperature has dropped to a level where sleep is difficult, where bodies are working harder just to maintain warmth, and where the cognitive load of managing the situation is beginning to degrade decision-making. Children are exhausted and frightened. Elderly members of the household have gone quiet in a way that is worrying. And by hour 96, day 4, if nothing external has changed and no internal preparation has bridged the gap, you are no longer managing a survival situation. You are losing one. This is the danger window. It is not hypothetical. It is documented. It is the time period where wrong decisions get made, where people take risks they wouldn't normally take, and where the true cost of every gap in their plan becomes fully, painfully visible. The time to know about the danger window is not when you're inside it. It is right now. Consider the situation of family in a mid-sized Midwestern city during a severe ice storm in the winter of 2019. Names aren't important here. What happened is, this was a family of 4, 2 adults, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old. By almost any reasonable standard, they had done what they were told. They had bottled water, a supply of canned food, multiple flashlights, a battery-powered radio, and extra blankets throughout the house. They had heard the 72-hour advice and believed it. Their house was built in the 1960s. Older single-pane windows, minimal wall insulation, the kind of construction that bleeds heat at an accelerating rate once the furnace stops. When the grid went down across their region, they followed every piece of official guidance they had been given. They stayed home. They layered up. They rationed their food. They waited for restoration. By day 3, the interior of their house had dropped to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. By day 4, it was at 38. Their water pipes burst in the walls. Their youngest child, the 4-year-old, had stopped shivering, which is not a sign of recovery. It is a sign that the body has moved past the shivering response, which is a physiological alarm. A neighbor with a wood stove living 2 houses down took the family in before the situation became critical. They were 3 miles from the nearest designated warming shelter, which had stopped accepting new arrivals more than a day earlier. This family was not reckless. They were not ignorant. They were following the best advice they had been given, and the best advice they had been given was built for a different kind of emergency than the one they were living through. The gap almost closed around them permanently. The single most important physical resource in a winter grid-down survival scenario is not food. It is not water. It is a reliable, fuel-supplied, indoor-rated heat source that you own, understand, and have tested before the emergency begins. Everything else in your plan, your food, your water, your communications, your morale, your decision-making, degrades significantly and rapidly when your core body temperature begins dropping. Yet the dedicated heat source remains the most overlooked and underprepared element in the average American household's emergency plan. People buy a propane camp stove for cooking and tell themselves the energy problem is solved. It isn't. A standard portable camping stove produces between 3,000 and 10,000 BTUs of heat output. A typical American home in cold weather conditions requires between 50,000 and 100,000 BTUs per hour to maintain a habitable temperature across its full square footage. You cannot bridge that gap with a camp stove. You cannot will your way across it with extra blankets and layered socks. What you can do, and what genuinely prepared people actually do, is identify one room in your home, ideally the smallest interior room with the fewest exterior walls and windows, and designate that single space as your survival thermal zone. Concentrate your insulation, your sleeping gear, your people, and your heat source into that single room. A correctly sized indoor-rated propane or kerosene heater can maintain a 150 to 200 square foot space at survivable and even marginally comfortable temperatures on a manageable fuel budget across a multi-day event. That is not a comfortable plan. That is a living plan. In a real grid-down winter emergency. Those are not the same thing, and the distance between them is the distance between going home after this is over and not going home at all. The version of winter survival that gets sold to you across social media and mainstream prepper content features a wood stove in a rustic cabin, a loyal golden retriever stretched out by the fire, and shelves lined with beautiful glass jars of preserved food. Everything is warm and amber-lit and quietly competent. That version is a fantasy constructed for engagement, not for survival. The real version is a family compressed into one bedroom, wearing every piece of clothing they own simultaneously, rationing heat, rationing food, rationing their emotional reserves, watching the hours drag past, and trying to calculate at what point the danger of staying exceeds the danger of moving. The real version includes arguments fueled by fear and exhaustion. It includes a 3-year-old asking why it is so cold and not understanding the answer. It includes the specific, awful quiet of adults who have run out of reassuring things to say. That version doesn't generate high engagement because it is not aspirational, but it is the version you are actually preparing for when you take this seriously. If your plan functions beautifully in the cabin scenario, but breaks apart in the bedroom scenario, you don't have a survival plan. You have an aesthetic. The second critical gap that winter preparedness plans consistently ignore is the water collapse that follows a sustained grid-down event in freezing temperatures. When your home stops being heated, your pipes are at active risk of freezing within 24 to 48 hours depending on their location in the structure, the insulation quality, and outdoor temperatures. Once those pipes burst, you haven't just lost your running water for the duration of the event. You've potentially lost the structural and hygienic integrity of the space you're trying to survive in, because water damage in a cold, closed environment creates conditions that compound the crisis. Set that aside entirely and look at the raw numbers. A human being requires a minimum of 1 gallon of water per day for drinking and basic sanitation. Every October, millions of Americans walk past the seasonal emergency supply display at the hardware store, stop for a moment, think they should get around to that, and keep walking. Every November, the same thought, the same motion. And then December arrives, the weather turns sharp and serious, and suddenly the indoor-rated propane heaters are sold out and on backorder. The kerosene is limited, the quality cold weather sleeping bags are gone, and the window to prepare at leisure is closed hard. You've been watching this channel because some part of you already understands that the grid is not as resilient as the institutions managing it want you to believe. You already sense that the infrastructure is aging faster than it is being replaced, that extreme weather events are hitting harder and more frequently than the models predicted, and that the official 72-hour response timeline is a bureaucratic artifact and not a genuine operational promise for a widespread winter event. That instinct is not irrational. It is informed. The question is not whether a serious grid-down winter event is possible in your lifetime or your region. The question is whether you will be standing on the prepared side of the preparation window when it happens, or the other side. Here is the fast version of everything. Your house loses heat faster than you expect because thermodynamics doesn't care about your comfort level. The 72-hour kit is not sufficient for a winter grid-down event. Realistic survival planning starts at 14 days minimum. The danger window between hour 48 and hour 96 is the documented period when unprepared households move from uncomfortable to critical, and it is predictable and survivable if you know it is coming. Cold is a patient, methodical predator that operates on a biological timeline you can anticipate and counter with preparation. Your heat source must be properly sized, indoor rated, fueled for 2 weeks minimum, and tested before the emergency, never during it. Your water plan needs to extend a minimum of 2 weeks and must account for the pipe failure that follows an unheated home in freezing temperatures. Your food supply needs caloric density appropriate for cold weather metabolic demands, not just volume. Your communication setup must function completely independently of the power grid. Your plan must account for the real psychological and cognitive deterioration that occurs under sustained cold, darkness, and fear, because your decisions are as important as your supplies. And your carbon monoxide safety protocol is not a footnote or an afterthought. It is the single most important safety layer in your entire alternative heating setup, and it must be in place before you need anything else. Every gap you close today is a gap that cannot close you when winter comes down hard and the grid goes with it. Subscribe before you need this.